Every now and then a blockbuster comes out that is sort of a defining moment for a generation of moviegoers. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars. Movies that come out and that's the sort of movie that captures the world. This year had one such movie, and those movies don't come around very often. This year had one. Avengers Endgame. This is my custom fourth volume of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As you can see, it's not even really done. It still says Avengers 4 here. And again, I mean, I said this in my last video. This is complete. I have the bonus disc for Avengers Endgame. And I have a little Blu-ray that came. It was a Target exclusive that came with the first Avengers movie, and it's called Marvel Building a Cinematic Universe. So those are the last two discs, not Spider-Man Far From Home, not Black Widow. Avengers Endgame, I warn you now, for the 3 people that have not seen this movie, this review is going to have some spoilers about the movie in it. Not all of them, but enough. So be warned. This movie is fantastic. It is not quite as good as Infinity War. If you were to watch just those 2 movies as like a, what would it be, 5.5 hour experience? If you watch those 2 movies back to back, they create a very satisfying whole. But Infinity War had a tighter structure, had a shorter runtime. It had, the heroes were all sent off like on their individual teams, so there was a lot of switching up what was going on in the movie. Endgame is, a lot of people have called it this, it's a victory lap. It's the end of this saga, which they now call the Infinity Saga. Again, another reason I don't consider Spider-Man Far From Home the last movie, because it hasn't, the Infinity Stones, that story is wrapped up. So Spider-Man Far From Home has nothing to do with that. It follows the repercussions of Endgame, but so will all the Marvel movies going forward. So, we get basically the core Avengers team back, all scarred from the events of Infinity War. They have Ant-Man and Rocket Raccoon basically join the team. Captain Marvel very, very briefly, to the point where I really kind of question why Captain Marvel needed to be introduced in Phase 3 and show up in Endgame for 3 minutes. It just, to me, doesn't make any sense. They could have easily done the Black Widow movie in Phase 3, which makes a lot more sense to me considering what happens to Black Widow in this movie. And had that be part of the story instead of bringing in a character, not really letting us have much of a chance to get to know her, and then having her show up in Endgame and essentially do nothing. I mean, really, in that climactic battle, she really doesn't do much. I like that. I'll start with what I like. Now let me start with what I dislike, because I like so much about this movie, though. Let me get the nitpicks out of the way. I don't like that they found a loophole to bring Gamora back. Gamora, the whole thing with the Soul Stone and Infinity War, they made that sound like that was a pretty definitive thing, like she could not come back. And they found a loophole by going back into the past and bringing back the Gamora from the past, thus avoiding her death. Which, again, for a movie that talks about so much about the time travel plot, you have to avoid branching off realities. That doesn't make a ton of sense then. That you could take a Gamora from the past Because once you take her out of the past, put her in the future, then the events of her dying in Infinity War won't happen. So I don't really understand the logic of that. And plus, it just feels cheap. It's another Marvel avoiding the death of a popular character, killing somebody and then going, not really, not really. I know you all love her. We're bringing her back. Ditto that actually, again, spoilers, the other victim of the Soul Stone that we see in this movie, which is Black Widow. She sacrifices herself. But hey, next year we get the Black Widow movie, which I know is supposed to be a prequel, but it still feels cheap. Like, we have seen this character die, which means we know where that story goes. So giving us a prequel doesn't make any sense to me at this point. There's a lot of little things that bother me. I mean, I didn't feel Hulk got much of an ending. Like, all the other core Avengers got an end to their story. Really, I feel like everybody did. If this was the last Marvel movie with all of these characters, including Captain Marvel, I feel like they all got a send-off that was satisfying. You know, they're doing Thor Love and Thunder, you know, as part of Phase 4. I don't feel like I need to see the further adventures of Thor. I like that he's just sort of going off to sort of be who he is. He's accepted himself. He doesn't want to be the king of Asgard. He wants to be out there in space having adventures. That's what he wants, and he's accepted that. I don't need to see those adventures. Just like, you know, I mean, the Black Widow movie is supposed to, from what is being said, deal with Budapest. That was like a throwaway line in the first Avengers movie. It was a joke. It was never meant to be its own movie. Again, I've talked about superhero burnout. I'm not excited for any of the movies going forward. I mean, honest to God, there's not a single one of them where I go, oh, I have to see that. Oh, that's amazing. Oh, that's so great that they're making this. Nothing they have in Phase 4 gets me all that pumped. I'm more pumped for a couple of the shows, honestly. Falcon and the Winter Soldier and She-Hulk being the two big ones. But even Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I don't need to see what happens to the two of them. They both got a conclusion. And you can say, well, no, we want to see what happens when Falcon becomes Captain America. Do we? Do we really? Do we need that? We know that he will. We can imagine his adventures going forward. It's, to me, a lot like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. They ride off into the sunset, and you think, oh, all the adventures that Indy will still have. And then they give us Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and it's like, oh shit, that's the adventures that Indy had? What I had in my mind was so much better. There's a lot of little nitpicks like that. There's a lot of inconsistencies. There's a lot of things that don't quite add up. But the movie, because it is this conclusion, and a very, like I said, I feel definitive conclusion to this 22-film saga. It earns the audience suspension of disbelief. It earns us to not question the time travel stuff too much. You just are going along for the ride with this one. You're revisiting old friends, old moments from other movies. And for all of what happens, like I said, I don't think it's as strong as Infinity War. Excuse me. But in that last, half hour? That last half hour, that movie tops every other movie ever made as far as a grand spectacle and a really satisfying one. Pretty much everything that you want to have happen, and some things that you didn't know you wanted to have happen, but they turn out to be great, happen in that last half hour, including who lives, who dies. I had a whole other opinion of who should have lived and who should have died. Oh, God, excuse me. I apologize for that. But they subverted those expectations, and I'm glad they did. It actually is a very satisfying conclusion to what I thought I wanted. The movie not only manages to be this grand spectacle, I get teary-eyed watching it. There are moments, especially towards the end of this movie. The last shot of this movie wrecks me. When they bring back Tony Stark's original arc reactor at the end, I came very close to just outright bawling in the theater. This movie earns its epicness. Now, you could say to me, well, I thought that the end of Harry Potter, like Deathly Hallows 2, was more epic. Or I thought Return of the King was more epic. And that's fine. Everybody has their own opinion. But as far as, like, you know, a movie, God, earning that sort of epicness, when you built it up over 22 movies, to see the conclusion of certain characters, what happens to Captain America in this movie at the end is beautiful. There should be Oscars for this movie, and not just for effects. Downey and Chris Evans both deserve nominations for this movie. The directing deserves a nomination. The film itself deserves a nomination for Best Picture. This is not just a big superhero movie. This is the epic of this decade. This is the epic of this decade. It wasn't Star Wars. And we got all these sort of, oh, what about The Hobbit? No. What about Fantastic Beasts? No. This is it. And you can argue with me, well, I like this better, I like this better. And that's fine. But as far as something that captured the zeitgeist, Avengers Endgame, that's the one. That's the one that really did it. And again, it's kind of clunky. There's stuff that doesn't entirely work. But it is so satisfying that despite the fact that it is not quite as good as the 5-star Infinity War, I am still giving this, call it 4 3/4 star if you want. Really, it's a 5-star. It's a 5-star in the way that, for instance, all of the Lord of the Rings are to me. And yes, I like maybe one better than the other, but they're all one story to me. And this is the conclusion of a storyline that meant so much to me and my family. My kids grew up, well, I took them to the first Iron Man. You know, they've seen all the movies. And so for this to come out and really put a cap on that, my daughter was, who does not get emotional during movies, who usually doesn't even care about movies. I've seen her cry multiple times watching this movie. It's got that punch to it, that dramatic punch to it. Great action, great performances, a mythology that you feel is now wrapped up. Even the characters that are going to go on. You know, the Guardians of the Galaxy, for example. Yeah, we're getting Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and I'm sure it's going to be a search for Spock kind of thing with Gamora. Don't care. I watched that movie and I'm like, okay, they've got sort of a new ragtag team together. They brought in Thor. They brought in Nebula. They're going to go off and have adventures. And maybe Star-Lord will always mourn Gamora. You know, she's off, doesn't know who he is. They can't get it back. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with... They don't ever have to do Ironheart or what happens to Tony Stark's daughter when she grows up. And honestly, no more Avengers movies, in my opinion. If Marvel going forward, they've got the X-Men and the Fantastic Four back. Focus on those. Oh, God, so unprofessional. Sorry. Focus on those movies. Build up the X-Men. Build up the Fantastic Four. Build up to Galactus. Build up to Secret War. But as far as, like, the Avengers, that name, I think it should be done for a long, long time. If you want in Phase 10 to bring it back as some sort of epic return of these, not these characters, but like a new Avengers team, okay. But outside of that, I mean, it's just an Avengers 5. I mean, I think I just called it 4, but, you know, Infinity War and Endgame feel so much like a whole to me that it's hard to think of it as Avengers 4. Avengers 5 needs to be many years off because no matter what they do, I just don't see a Marvel movie ever topping this. I don't see a comic book movie ever topping this. It's hard for me to imagine any movie topping this. I mean, when I say that this is more of a satisfying conclusion than Return of the Jedi or Return of the King, as big a fan as I am of those movies, and I do like those movies better than Avengers Endgame, but this is such a satisfying conclusion to a series that I just don't really have any interest in what happens after. So, sorry, Marvel. So for a rating, Avengers Endgame, 5 out of 5. I'm going 5 out of 5. This is a fantastic movie. This is a masterpiece. Masterpiece. And I do not use that word lightly. This is a masterpiece. And think of it what you will. If you didn't like it, whatever. This captured the imagination of the world. And, you know, having a movie come out that makes $1 billion is nothing new these days. Having a movie come out and be the #1 movie of all time does not happen very often. And Avengers Endgame absolutely earns being in that top spot and should for many, 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 many years to come.